I want to talk about some topics that are tangential to strategic planning, some considerations that people don't take as they are developing their strategic plans, and interweave some of my personal experiences in that. And there's three areas I'm going to talk about, and the first one is your organization, or your people. Do you have people that are capable of developing a strategic plan? Do you have people that are capable of implementing that plan? I've seen literally hundreds of strategic plans put together. Some of them are really beautiful plans, well thought out, and I've seen them be virtually worthless because they didn't have the people that knew how to put a plan together. They just hired some consultants, got marketing data, crammed it all together, used a spreadsheet, and the problem with spreadsheets is that they can fool you and make you feel comfortable by just putting factors in there, growth factors and stuff like that just may or may not be attainable. So one area that I think people don't think about is their organization and the people that they have that are going to be working on a strategic plan. And as a side note, over the years, I've done a lot of coursework, got a bunch of postgraduate degrees. I went to seminars. I mean, the companies I worked for, Burroughs Corporation, Northrop Grumman, and stuff like that, sent us to dozens of seminars over the years. Harvard, Wharton, and 1-week seminars. And then it seems like somebody thinks I need to read more, and I get a book once a month on management. And all this stuff comes in. Some of these books are worthless. Some of these books you can get the point across in 10 pages, not 200. And some of the books are worthwhile. But as I sorted through all that material over the years, I found that relative to managing people, I found what I call 4 basic elements, and I call them the primary colors of good management. Now, I know there's only 3 primary colors in nature, red, blue, and yellow, but I came up with 4 ideas, so I had to talk about 4. So I made white the color that covers the whole spectrum. So the first element was integrity. And that sounds kind of namby-pamby. Everybody, you don't lie, you tell the truth, you don't steal money, you don't cheat people. But integrity has, in business, has a very fundamental base that you can't deny. I'm talking about people who will tell you, I can't do this. People that won't blame, a manufacturing guy won't blame engineering for a mistake and try to get the problem shifted to somebody else. Somebody will own up and say, I created the problem, this is what I'm going to do to fix the problem, and this is what I'm going to do to avoid the problem ever happening again. In strategic planning, that's important because you're asking people their opinions, because there's no science. You try to make some of this subjective material objective, and there's a lot of game tools, but ultimately at the end, the strategy is going to come up to the point where you collectively as an organization believe this is the right thing and you can do it. So there's an art. Now, in the past experience, I was running for Burroughs Corporation. I was the head of the group that did financial products. And we wanted to penetrate the Bank of China. And there was no way to penetrate it through traditional manners. So we decided to form a joint venture with a Chinese company, which is owned by the government, because that's the way they operated in those days. This is back in the early 80s. And it's in the Yunnan province of China. Kunming is the capital. When I went to Kunming, there were no cars. Nobody owned cars. They all rode bicycles or mules, or they had little steam carts that would transport material. And that was a very, very rudimentary environment. The hotel I stayed at, the power was shut off at 10 o'clock at night. So that was it. I mean, pitch black. There was no emergency lights, that would go on when the power was lost. It was pitch black, and what was even worse was that when the cisterns on top of the building were drained of water, there was no power on to repump the water back up. So if you wanted to take a shower in the morning, you had to get up very early, or the water would be gone. And you also didn't want to be the first person to take a shower after the cisterns had been emptied and filled up again. You didn't want to be that person. So there was an environment that was much different than the environment I came from. High tech, high standard of living, we all had multiple cars, stuff like that. So I spent some time with the company that we were going to form the joint venture with. And they had failed the 2 previous joint ventures, and I had to know why they failed so we wouldn't repeat the mistake. The first joint venture they had was with a Japanese company, and the Japanese at that time looked down on the Chinese as inferior people. And there was not a trust that was built up between them. And over time, when the Japanese were supposed to send parts to the joint venture for them to use, the parts were typically used parts, secondary parts that came out of rejects from their production. They just dumped on the Chinese. And that wasn't, a high integrity type of relationship. And that joint venture failed. The next joint venture they had was with a Russian company, and both of them were communist nations, and the government wanted them to form some type of a commercial relationship. And the Russians had no concept back in the early 80s of anything commercial. So nothing happened on time, nothing was documented properly, and that joint venture failed. And as a result, the Chinese did not trust the Russians, did not trust the Japanese, and they had no reason to trust us as Americans because less than 10 years earlier, the Vietnam War was going on. Yunnan province is just north of Vietnam, and the materials that the Chinese were providing to the North Vietnamese, both manpower and equipment, was coming from Yunnan. So there was a little bit of distrust. So we set a goal at the beginning that we had to build their trust immediately, and the best time to build trust is up front in a relationship. So when we were writing our contracts for the joint venture, and we made commitments, like we said, okay, we'll give you 20 man-weeks of training, technical training on the products that we want you to assemble. The concept was we would provide them sub-assemblies, they would assemble the product, ship it to the Bank of China, and support the product, install it and support it. That was the concept of the joint venture. So when we said we'll give you 20 man-weeks of training, we planned ourselves internally to do 30. If we said we're going to give them 10 models of a product for them to train on, we gave them twice as many in our plan. And so early in the relationship, they trusted us. And invariably, somewhere along the line, we're going to goof up. The Americans are going to goof up, and we did. About 6 months into the joint venture, we sent a bunch of disk drives out to them, and our logistics department within the company had staged these disk drives in a warehouse that was next to a huge electric generator. And there was EMI being generated out of those generators that corrupted the disk. So when the Chinese got the disks, they didn't work. And so the first reaction would have been, if we hadn't built up that trust, they would have said, "There, the Americans are trying to screw us," and here it is. But instead, since we had already built their confidence, they said, "Oh, there was a mistake," and we got through it. About a week or so later, we got good drives. We figured out what happened, got good drives to them. So we built up this trust, and they saw us as dealing with a company that had integrity. And that was a very important factor in any type of business relationship, is the integrity. Whether it's you're in a large corporation and you're dealing with another department, or whether you're dealing in a joint venture or with a customer, integrity is extremely important. The next aspect that you should check before you do a strategy is, do I have the best people? Not the second best, but do I have the best people in my organization that I could find? And that's always a hard thing. There's lots of courses and consultants that will tell you how to pick the best people. But you want to strive to get the best people in your organization, because then you'll get the best ideas for your strategy, and you'll have the best people that can implement it. You want people that are better than your competition, not equal to your competition or inferior. You want better people than your competition. Another story was back in my financial product days. We had a line. The joint venture was really building teller terminals for the Bank of China. We also had a set of products that were document processors, things that process checks, encoded them, read checks, so banks could transfer money between them, and we can manage all the credit card receipts. Everything was in paper in those days. So we had, there were 3 markets, low end, medium, and high end, and we were second to third in each one of those markets. So how are we going to get to the first place? And the answer was I had to go out and find the best possible people. And I found people at the high end, the high speed. I've hired this guy, Dr. Borgerson, a brilliant guy, and I had to pay him almost twice what I was making to get him into my organization. But that was an artificial constraint. You know, if I had the best person working for me, my job's easier, regardless of what I paid him or what I paid myself. You know, I had to get the best people. 2 years later, we dominated IBM at the high end, we dominated NCR at the middle range, and we dominated Bank Tech, which was at the low end. We dominated. Now, my lawyers hate when I use the word dominant because that has antitrust connotations. But the best people will get the best job done if the job can be done. You also have to make sure you have a productive environment. Back in my early days of my career, there was, next to my operation was a parts fabrication shop. And they manufactured parts for the assembly plants within Burroughs Corporation. And it was all internal demand. It wasn't external demand. And the fellow managed the shop by dominated the management team by keeping all the information to himself. And as a result, the shop got into serious trouble. And because he didn't have the whole team working on the shop, it wasn't a productive environment. You have to create an environment where these best people who have integrity can prosper, and that's your job as a manager to create that environment. So magically, out of the blue, they fired him and they asked me to run the shop. And what we saw in the shop was a cost per produced hour of $44. Now at $44 back, and this is in the late 70s, back in those days, $44 an hour was fairly expensive. And as a result, the assembly factories were beginning to look outside of my fab shop to buy their parts because they can get them cheaper. So we obviously had to do something about this. Now these are the various elements of cost. Includes utilities, corporate allocation, material, scrap material, downtime, machine repair, all the different elements that make up the total cost allocated over the hours that we were producing. The large one was wages. So we had to attack that. So when I took over, obviously the first thing in our strategy was to come up with a way to reduce our cost per hour. And we were coming up with some pretty good ideas, but it was 25 cents here, 50 cents there, all good ideas, but we weren't going to get to where we had to be. We had to be in the low 30s to be competitive. So we weren't getting there. So I decided to take a different tact and change the environment in which we were operating. Instead of keeping information close at hand between myself and my trusted staff, we brought all the employees in and included them on every aspect of this cost, let them understand what the goal was, and that was the low $30 an hour. And that included the machinists, who were UAW and Teamsters. So now I have, in a large cafeteria, I didn't have PowerPoint or even Harvard graphics in those days, so I had to write a big piece of paper and put this chart up there. And I had listed in all the different costs per hour, and this being wages. And then I pointed out to them why this was critical to change, because it meant their jobs. Ultimately, we're going to disappear. Now, 9 months forward, we were going to go into UAW negotiations, contract negotiations for the Detroit area. We had about 8,000 employees. I had about 500. So we were not going to control those negotiations. But I told them that what's going to be focused on was going to be this number, and that is their wages. Now the company's going to try to push that down, UAW is going to try to push that up, but that was almost irrelevant to our survival because that was what we had to tackle. So I asked all of them to get involved and find ways to chip away at all these things, and this will be controlled by people that are outside our control. By involving everybody in that process, we got lots more ideas. We were able to capture a lot more ideas, and we ended up with a cost per hour of $32 an hour. The wages kept the same. I mean, the contract, they went on strike for a couple of weeks. Nothing changed, which was the way it was in the last 3 or 4 contracts. Nothing ever changes. But the overhead cost per hour had changed. Once we achieved this, we then could go outside outside our captive base, which were other boroughs' assembly plants, and get work in from other companies, external work. And that additional work diluted our fixed expense, and we ended up with a cost per hour of $27 an hour. Because we had this cost structure, but we brought more work in, so it diluted the fixed expenses. And the fab shop survived, and I got a big promotion, and everybody was happy. But the way we got there was we included everybody, and we created an environment that they knew as much as we knew, and everybody has the same motivation, and that is success, and this is what we got. It was way beyond anything that we had envisioned. So our strategy before was get costs down and get work from the outside, and that was a good strategy, simple strategy, but it was useless unless you found a way to execute. And we found a way to execute by bringing everybody involved into the process. The last item I have of these primary colors is business engineering. If you're a manager of a business, you're responsible for engineering how you do that business. There are not fixed ways of doing business. There may be regulations, there may be rules, there may be customer demands, but you have to design how you want to do business. You're not stuck in the same rut that you have had in the past. To make continuous improvement and to beat the competition, you have to re-engineer your business. And you got to assume that as part of your strategy. Now I'll harken back to the job I got after the fab shop, and I was asked to run an electronics factory in Flemington, New Jersey. This factory, they had fired the previous 2 general managers because they were not producing, and so I got the task. The environment was we were building terminals, about as complex as PCs, but they were fixed function terminals that hooked up to mainframes. This is the early 80s, so we didn't have PCs yet. And these terminals, we co-designed the terminals with Hitachi. They did some design, we did some design. They did manufacturing, we did some manufacturing. And the concept of the environment was that whoever had the best quality and the lowest cost would get 60% of the production. And those who were inferior got 40% of the production. But the reality of the situation was that if that gap between the 2 facilities was big enough, then the one that was doing the best would get all the production, the other guy would disappear. So we were at the low end of that, we were at the bottom of that. We had to find a way to leapfrog over the Japanese, to Hitachi, to have higher quality, lower cost. Now, back in the early 80s, every American manufacturer was hopping on airplanes and flying over to Japan to learn about Kanban, zero defects, and all that, all the Deming work and so forth. And you could barely even get a flight to get over to Japan and back. But my thought, and we did that too, but my thought was, holy cow, if I learn from them, that's good, I learned something, but I'm never going to be better than them. How am I going to have my facility be the dominant in this relationship? So I figured we had to think outside the box. Because our chairman, a couple of years earlier, the chairman of the company, this is Burroughs Corporation, the chairman of the company had decided to hire A.D. Little to do an assessment of our manufacturing. $2 million, and about 6 months later, they came up and said, we're pretty good. And they couldn't come up with any real recommendation to do better. Well, the chairman got mad, threw that out, hired Goose Allen to do the same thing, $2 million later, and 6 months later, they came to the same conclusion. My conclusion was, okay, we're the best, but we're not good enough. So something has to change. We had the best industrial engineers, we had the best design. We got to find a way to take a leapfrog up. So we had to get, in our strategy, we had to come up with different ideas. Now, where are you going to get different ideas? You can't ask the same people you've been talking to help you come up with new ideas for your strategy. So we decided to go outside of the box and hire people that were not traditional in our industry. The first area that I concentrated on, I happened to be in Hong Kong, and I was visiting the Wang brothers. And they manufactured in Hong Kong, but mostly in the New Territories, but they're stationed in Hong Kong. And they made Donkey Kong toys, the Donkey Kong video toy, and the Nintendo sets. And they made thousands a day of those sets. So I was marveling. These were not, they seemed like toys, but they were fairly sophisticated. They had microprocessors in them, they had electronics in them, and their arrival quality was 100%. Because if you're manufacturing toys and people start buying the toys and 1% don't work, you lose your reputation. No parent's going to buy that toy for their kids because it just creates frustration. So they had figured out how to get 100% perfect quality in their arrivals. So I poached a couple of engineers. I went in there and hired a couple of guys, brought them to the States and said, you're part of my advanced team. I need to know what you're thinking. Donkey Kong's a toy, it's not a sophisticated computer, but they had ideas that were different than what our guys were thinking of. Next, down the road about 5 miles was a company called Continental Can, and they manufactured cans. Now, what can I learn from Continental Can when I'm building electronics? And what I saw was, when they were producing cans, various different sizes, various different materials, various different opening mechanisms, various different labels, and they were all coming out the end of the line without any type of real manual intervention. So they were somehow putting plans in, and out the end of the line, without reset up, they were producing cans. So I'm sitting there saying, wow, there's something that they understand. Now, I know it's not electronics, but there's something in the way they're doing their business that allows them to efficiently be very flexible. And that hit a chord with me, because while the Japanese at the time were very good at manufacturing, they required fixed schedules for 90 days. You had a schedule for 90 days, you could not change that schedule. And as a result, they produced configurations of products that were fixed 90 days in advance, and if you forecasted wrong, you held inventory. And so it was a very expensive process. They built great, perfect products, they're high quality, but they built what they wanted to build for that 90 days and you couldn't change it. So they lacked flexibility. Continental Can, on the other hand, had flexibility, so I wanted their thinking. So I poached an engineer out of Continental Can. Then we figured I needed some additional brain power. I went to MIT and hired a couple engineers right out of MIT with masters that had in information technology that I felt I needed to put into this mix of thought. And then I took the best engineers, because after all, A.D. Little and Goose Allen said our guys are the best, so I took some of our best engineers, put them into an advanced team to come up with a new way of manufacturing electronics. And we came up with a process called BTCO, Build to Customer Order. And the concept was that everything we built was a unique item. It had a serial number. And every part, major part that went in there that was variable, like disk drives, memory, size of memory, the type of microprocessor, all were configurable. And each one of those pieces has an individual identity. So that when an order came in for one of our products, a single unit. Now they may have ordered hundreds at a time, but each one had a single identity. And when that order went into the system, we identified exactly what piece was going to go into that product, regardless of whether the piece was in inventory or on its way from Intel or on its way from the disk drive manufacturer. We identified that item specifically. And if the schedule changed, it would ripple through and those identities would be changed out. As a result of all this, our fortunes changed. They changed. Our factory went from a $70 million a year factory to $770 million. Our inventory went from $50 million, which was horrible when you had a $70 million shipment, went to $20 million, which was very good turn. Our obsolescence went from $15 million a year down to zero because we had control of all our inventory, and most of it was still in the hands of our suppliers. We didn't own it. In fact, we had negative inventory because we paid our vendors after the customers paid us. So we had a negative inventory, which meant we never owned anything that wasn't already in use. So we had zero obsolescence. Back originally when I got to the factory, we had 1,000 employees, and they were working 6.5 days a week. I mean, ridiculous hours. And they obviously were failing because they were tired. No time off, we were just beating everybody. When we got to the 770 million, we had the same, not the same, but we still had 1,000 people only select overtime, which was mostly in engineering when we had some projects that had to go through some equipment that had limited capacity, so we would work overtime. So we were enormously successful. Hitachi was shut down from producing the product, and we got to 100% of the production. That was like in 2 years from the time we started. And I got another promotion. That's great. Now I'm going to switch from your organization, and I'm going to talk about a black swan. A black swan event. A black swan event is something that can happen to your company that destroys it, eliminates it. It could be, for example, it could be a pharmaceutical company that loses all its patents. And then suddenly now they have to compete in an open market. It could be an automotive company that has to recall all its products multiple times. It could be enough to take a company under. So black swan events can occur. You may never see one in your lifetime, but when you're doing your strategic plan, you ought to sit back and say, what are the possible black swans? And how can I do something to detect it and do something to avoid it? I experienced the black swan when I was with Northrop Grumman, or actually Litton Industries at the time. The electronic industry was going nuts. You had healthy growth from about 96 steady all the way up to 2000, and then it went nuts. It almost went vertical. It was irrational, but it was there. It was the telecom market. Cell phones were coming out, and all the cell phone manufacturers and the infrastructure manufacturers wanted to get market share, so they bought everything, whether it meant logic or not. They bought anything and everything they could get. So us being a supplier to that industry, our demand went crazy. It was irrational. I never did figure out what that guy was doing, but it was an irrational market, but it was there and it was real, and companies are making fortunes. One of the companies at this time, I was at this point in my career, I was managing a portfolio company, about 12 companies. One of them was Airtron. And Airtron made gallium arsenide wafers. And gallium arsenide wafers are used primarily in the transmitting part of your cell phone. So it was a substrate that could handle power, whereas silicon substrates for integrated circuits could not. So we made gallium arsenide wafers. It starts by growing a crystal, actually growing a crystal, and then machining the crystal into a wafer and then delivering it to the customer, who then processed it with integrated circuits. We had two main competitors, Sumitomo in Japan, who supplied gas wafers to the Japanese telecom market, and Freiberger in Germany that produced it for Europe, and we, Airtron, were the primary producers for the American companies. Now, Freiberg and Sumitomo had announced major capacity improvements. Sumitomo was going to add $100 million to their capacity. Freiberger was adding 80, because the market, from all the analysts, said this is what's going to happen. Here's 01, here's where we are today. Holy cow, this market is going to continue without any interruption, was going to continue to grow. And if we didn't add capacity, we're going to be out of the ball game. I had CEOs and chairmen of Triquint, Motorola, calling me up and say, look, we want to keep our production in America. We want you guys to supply it. You have very good quality, good technology, but you got to increase your capacity or we're going to have to buy from Sumitomo or Freiberger. So we had put together a plan to increase our capacity, but I dithered on implementing that plan because the technology was changing. They were going from a straight gas wafer to an epi-impregnated wafer to another technology. And if we're going to add our capacity, what technology should I add that capacity with? Should it be the very next technology, or should I leapfrog and grab another one that's further down? That was part of our strategic thinking. And I dithered. It appeared to dither. My staff thought I had dithered, because they were pounding me every day. This is an extract, an actual extract from our strategic plan back there, back in the time we were looking at expanding our capacity. On the opportunity side, this is the SWOT chart, one of the SWOT charts. On the opportunity side, we had to exploit our exclusive access to gallium. It turns out that my vice president of market development had a PhD in chemistry from Hopkins, and he had determined that a byproduct of another process for another material yielded ore that had gallium in it. And nobody knew this. And the gallium, we figured out a way to get that gallium out. So now with the market going nuts the way it was before, access to gallium was part of your strategy. You had to have a strategy. How am I going to get gallium? And so we bought 140 tons of this dirt, shipped it into this field in New Jersey, put a fence around it, and we had gallium that our competitors couldn't get. So our costs were going to be lower, and we had access to gallium. So that was a great competitive advantage. Then we said we had to increase our capacity, and we had to leverage our gallium availability by both price and the fact that it was available to us. Our threats was that our competition was expanding their technology, and we would lose out if they gained customers, gained a foothold, especially in our customer base. And we felt that ultimately the mining companies would come up with more access to gallium, so our advantage of having this 140,000 tons of dirt, which was part of our strategy, would only last a year. So we had to make hay, win customers, and when the gallium shortage subsided and our competitors were able to increase their production, we were already positioned and we wouldn't lose it. So that was a threat. So this is where we were. There was no end to the world. But then the crisis occurred. This demand went vertical the opposite direction and continued to decline in a very short period of time. The market just collapsed on us. Now, we were at the beginning of the supply chain. And when you're at the beginning, the bottom of the supply chain, things that happen at the top of the supply chain are amplified. And that's because of inventory. So when the manufacturer, the end user, shipped 20% less product to their customer, they also had to absorb the inventory they had in their pipeline, which meant the wafer manufacturer, integrated circuit manufacturer, probably lost 40%. These are just approximate numbers, because it really depends on what the supply chain consists of. But then down to where the guys were making the wafers, a 20% change there was amplified to a 60% change. So what happened? On April Fool's Day, the president of Airtron calls me up and says that 100% of our backlog was canceled. So I called up the same guys that were at Motorola, Triquin, and others, and who were complaining that they didn't have enough capacity, and said, what's going on? What are you going to do? I have production in process. You got to at least buy that. And they said, nope, you ship anything, we're going to ship it right back, and we'll see you in court. Oh, okay. So our backlog went to zero, and that was our black swan. Now, people anticipated that nothing like this ever lasts forever. But if we go back, we were responding right here to this. People said, oh, it's going to recover, but it never did. So we anticipated from our intelligence, which we used to garner for our strategic planning purposes, said that this was probably going to happen. And so we said, what do we do? We have no work in our factory, none at all. Now, we had been developing additional technologies. Do we have time? How long is it going to be before we get more orders? And the customer is saying, oh, in about 3 or 4 months, we'll put more orders. Well, I could probably survive 3 or 4 months. But I don't think it's going to be 3 or 4 months. I think it's going to be 18 months. And so what we ended up doing, we sold the company. We sold the assets of the company. We were dead in the water, and there was no way to recover. Fortunately, when we took this company over about a year and a half earlier, we said we can't just depend on gallium arsenide wafers for telecom. And we started developing other wafers, other crystals that would be used for LED markets, which were more diverse than gallium arsenide markets. And we had developed some good technology, had some equipment. We were in the engineering development stage, but we could not get it to market in time to be able to save the company. So we touted our capability, our intellectual property, all the equipment we had, and we sold the company for a pretty good price. But we lost the business. The next aspect of strategic planning that you should consider, and I think most companies do this, but it's a BHAG. Why don't you set a big, hairy, audacious goal? Something that's really out of contention, out of your mind. These are actually actual pictures I took of a gorilla when I was in Rwanda, and that's 875 pounds. And this is when he charged me. I was laying on my back taking pictures of him. But a big, hairy, audacious goal. So we were part of Litton Industries at the time, and I was managing this portfolio of companies. And we had presented to the board of directors this plan here, this purple pink chart. And they were just ecstatic. I got 15% annual growth. Profits are growing 20% per year. You guys are heroes. And we had had a history of delivering what we promised, so they were really happy. So after they approved the plan, I didn't leave the presentation area. I said, but I have this other thought. And I showed them this big, hairy, audacious goal of having 27% CAGR that would be matched with a 40% CAGR in our income. We were already the most profitable division in the company, and we laid this on. The only issue was I needed about $400 million of capital, which we didn't have. Just a minor thought. So I left with this plan approved, but they were thinking about how to raise the capital for the other plan. So what happened? The board of directors decided, Litton at the time was made up of 4 organizations, we were one. And they decided to sell one of the organizations to raise the capital to fund my plan. And that was very nice. Northrop Grumman came around, and Northrop Grumman is a defense company, and they were primarily aeronautics. They did the stealth bombers and the F-16s and stuff like that. Within Litton, one of the groups that they were targeting to sell was a group that did controls. They did radar detection and various different detection devices, which are critical in a military environment. So that was the division they were selling, and Northrop wanted that division. But when they looked at that division, they looked at the rest of Lytton, and one of the other organizations in Lytton was Ingalls Shipyard, and they produced destroyers, and they were down in Pascagoula, Mississippi, and Avondale, Louisiana. So I said, you know, we ought to branch out and not just do aeronautics, but also do sea warfare. So they decided they would add to their acquisition the Ingalls Shipyard. Then they looked at the fourth division, and it was Task, and it did all the black ops. It did the black ops for the CIA and NSA. They did all the database and all the communications. Really hairy stuff. And so they decided they would want that division too. So now they're going to buy all of Northrop Grumman. But then I'm sitting out here with these commercial businesses, and they said, come along anyway. But they got enthralled because our profits were unlimited. In the defense business, your profits are limited. The government will only pay you so much. If your costs go up, they absorb it, but you get a margin. If your costs go down, the price goes down. So they're fixed at a certain percent. But in commercial business, the sky's the limit. And we were, even though we went through this difficult period with Airtron and some of the other companies we had, we were still generating profits that really embarrassed the rest of the divisions. So I said, let's bring those guys along. So Northrop purchased us, and including the whole company, Lytton, including my company, and they financed our BHAG. And we delivered what it was without Airtron, of course. That disappeared, but we delivered what we had promised, that 40% CAGR. And I got to retire, you know, with a good pension and bonuses and stuff like that. So these are, I didn't want to talk about strategic planning specifically, but these are some aspects. The people that you employ, do they have the ideas, and do they have the guts to implement a strategy? Do you have a black swan that can haunt you? Or on the other side of the scale, do you have a BHAG that you can take advantage of? And those are considerations you need to have in your strategic plan.